Hi, it's Laurie at Sew Right, and today I'm going to show you how to make consistent strips for continuous binding for your quilt. I have here as a sample, don't look at the quality of the work. This was pulled from our free motion machine, but this is an example of an unfinished quilt. You're going to find that we've got a layer up top that's called the top of the quilt. We've got the middle, that's our batting, and the back is called the backing. So we've got a quilt sandwich. And customarily, when you finish a quilt, you've done all your quilting and you've got your raw edges. So what you need to do to complete the whole quilt is to create binding, which is a measured piece that goes along the edge to create a nice, crisp, clean finish. Customarily, we use 2.5-inch strips for that process. One way you could get those strips is to purchase it at a big box store. That method I wouldn't recommend because we don't know the quality of those pieces. It may not necessarily fit as well thematically with the quilt that you've created, and you've spent so much time creating that quilt top, you want it to look like it belongs on the edge of the quilt. Every unit of your quilt should look like it belongs together. So one way to cut those pieces, and customarily again they're 2.5-inch strips, is cutting them by hand, cutting by the width of the fabric, and then simply measuring 2.5 inches, and then cutting with your rotary cutter like this. And then you're going to cut several of these. You're going to measure the perimeter of your quilt, all 4 edges, and then I would add at least 12 to 24 inches more to that because you're going to be mitering these units together. Customarily, when you're cutting binding strips, we're using the width of the fabric. So you're cutting with your folded edge, your salvages together, a 2.5-inch strip. So I've already cut off this edge and I can continue making further cuts, but a lot of the issues sometimes in cutting is getting accurate cuts. And it all depends again on your tools. So your tried and true method of cutting 2.5 strips might not work depending on how able you are to create successful cuts. Particularly like this ruler, for example, unlike the other ruler I used, has some wibble and wobble in it. So I might start off going gangbusters, and then I might go off and skew it, and then I've ruined my edge of my fabric and I'd have to recut it again. So an alternative method that we find quite successful is using a machine like the Accuquilt Go. And it's a great machine for anyone who has to do a number of these 2.5-inch strips for a large binding like for a quilt, or again, as I mentioned, jelly roll. You could create a number of 2.5-inch strips to create like a jelly roll rug or quilt or whatever you might want to do that entails a 2.5-inch strip. In the board embedded in there are these lines, and each of them is a line where the blade lies. So I'm going to be able to cut 3 2.5-inch strips on this board. Let me show you how easy that is. So I'm going to line up my fabric, and again, you don't have to clean it up because the beauty of it is the blades will. I'm going to line up on the board this way. I've got my fold on this line here. Okay, and then I am going to cross go back and forth on this, making sure I cover that blade. This board can cut up to 6 layers of fabric successfully. And again, I don't want to waste, so I just want to fold it this way so I can get as many strips as I can. All right. So now I've got my board in place. I'm going to put my mat on. And how this machine operates is our cutting mat normally is on the ground. We've got it uprighting up on the top with the blades on the bottom. This is also great if you have any arm, hand ailments. Helps aid you in the cutting process. So I am now going to just feed the board through the machine. All right. Let's see what happens. It's got a lot of static cling, so I'm going to angle my board like this and pick up my mat like this. See that static cling? And look at how many strips I've created. 2. This looks like that's left over. That's 4. That's 6, 7, because I had a weird folded cut. So all the remnants are these guys. Consistently cut because the board is consistent, and normally when we cut, we may get a little bowing in the middle. These are great, they're just straight. So they're very consistent, so which will make piecing these strips together that much easier to do. Depending on your creation, you can cut it on the cross grain or the lengthwise grain. If you've got an interesting pattern that is something like this, what might create something unique and interesting is to cut that on the bias so that your binding is on an angle, looks like this. If I didn't cut it on the bias, it would just go straight a grain across. Also, it depends again on your quilt. Say that you've got a quilt that undulates, it has a wave, a curve. You can't use cross grain, lengthwise grain to attach the binding. You're going to have bias to account for the curves in the quilt because it'll stretch properly. All right, so that's one method. Also, if you have scraps and you don't have one uniform size, you can make it very scrappy and combine units of different strips to create your binding again. So I could marry this one with this if I wanted a real funky look, and I would cut it and miter it. So I'm going to discuss mitering later on in this conversation, all right? You could also, I know I said not prepackaged, but say that you created a quilt using a jelly roll. You could take your leftover pieces and create one continuous length and use that and attach that as binding to the edge of your quilt. So that would be something fun, and again, because it was part of your quilt, it would be unique to your quilt as well. Next step now is to put this all together for one continuous roll of 2.5-inch strips, because we want a continuous binding. I have my 2.5-inch strips cut. You can see my pile here. I've got 2 right here on the table just to show you how to make it continuous. And you could sew end to end like this with whatever seam allowance, usually 1/4 inch there. But it looks a little choppy and it isn't very strong. And if you had an interesting print or some weird fabric and you're trying to match here, you would definitely see that it doesn't match. So the recommended way for strength and integrity and for better flow and blending with your fabrics is to create a mitered join. So what I do is I take this strip, then I take its friend, the other strip, and have them kiss, I'll call it, okay? And so that's right sides are facing in towards each other. I want it on the perpendicular. And I have to be careful in terms of the miter, basically is a 45-degree angle from the top point to the bottom. I don't want it sew it this way because when I fold it, it's going to fold onto itself, which you're going to have to rip out. You're going to have to use your friend the seam ripper. So you want to make sure that you're making your miter 45-degree angle from the outer edge to the lower edge. So let me just give you an example. If I use my pen here as my seam allowance or pretend to do so, it's going to go looking like that, okay? So you could eyeball it, which a lot of people do, but then you got a wonky miter. So it's best to take your time and to do it right. We've positioned our fabric. We've discussed where I should mark. So I'm marking from this point A to point B here. So depending on your eyesight, I kind of just like to make little marks here and here. Now to hold it securely, what I would recommend is using a pin so it won't wobble. I could try to use a normal glass head pin, but the problem is when I mark, the head tends to be round. So I can't get a good grip on my ruler. It's going to wobble, which will create issues in marking it accurately. So I would prefer using a flat head pin like this flower head pin. That way I can easily leave the pin in while I'm marking. So here we go. I've got the flathead pin in. I'm going to use, I marked here, I marked there. I'm going to use my ruler. And I'm going to make sure I have nothing else underneath me, like this pencil. So you're going to use a marking pen of your choosing to create your sew line. So I am going to sew from this point to that point on the sewing machine to create my miter. I've sewn my 45-degree angle. I'm just going to test beforehand because I might have to take my friend the seam ripper, and it's a nice even join. So what I will now do is I will trim off that trim off the triangle, I should say, to create a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay. And there we go. So I'm going to continue doing this again to make sure I have enough to go along the perimeter of my whole quilt. Plus, I guess I would say 12 to 18 inches extra because of the miters and because of the joining and the mitering on the corner of each corner of the quilt. We'll have to make a turn on each corner. So I want to make sure I have enough fabric to do so. I hope you enjoyed this binding tutorial. Thanks for watching.